Actually, it's an honor for me to present two speakers that agreed to join us in this discussion. This is Daniel Marzona and Julian Heinen. I will start with Daniel very shortly because I believe both of the speakers will speak better for themselves than all the facts that I do written here. But Daniel is a curator, writer, and a gallery owner. And if I might add, Vartai gallery friend as well. We are thankful for his support and for his attendance of our events, and this is the second time that Daniel here is in Lithuania. Daniel started his career as a curator. He worked in PS1 Modern Museum of Art in New York. He's also a co-founder of publishing company. As an author, actually, an editor, he published numerous of the books and publication about contemporary art, and minimal art and conceptual art were published by such a publication company, Taschen. Daniel Marzona also directed Berlin branch of Konrad Fischer Gallery, and in 2014 he opened his own gallery, Daniel Marzona, that now represents 15 international known famous artists. Julian Heinen, thank you for coming to this discussion. Julian came just to be with us tonight, so thank you for that. Julian is a curator and a writer specializing in contemporary art as well. He worked with and wrote about artists such as Bruce Bauman, Franz West, Rodney Graham, Andreas Gursky, and many others famous names known in artistic scene. Julian was a director of exhibition in Kunstmuseen and artistic director of K21 in Düsseldorf. I have to mention that in 2003-2005 he was a commissioner at German pavilion in Venice Biennale, in 2008 curator at Shanghai Biennale, and 2017 curated Georgian pavilion at Venice Biennale. So I have to stop now because I believe there's already a lot of information about two of the speakers. Please join the scene, and for the audience, feel free to ask questions because these two important people are not very often in Lithuania. Julian is first time, Daniel is second time, and they have a lot of to share and a lot of insights and their personal experience. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting us. It's a great pleasure, although the weather could be finer. We've got a fairly good impression. I got a very good impression, I think, of the town, and I'll come back for sure. Daniel, how shall we start? I think maybe we could start with each of us, our personal relationship with minimalism and conceptualism, because although I think there are like 10 or more years between us in age, I never calculate something like that. We both felt a very strong impact from these two tendencies in the arts of the second half of the 20th century. Maybe we start with you because you have a very particular relationship and a very personal one, and you could possibly explain that.
Sure. I mean, other than Julian, I wasn't like an eyewitness, so to speak, just because I'm a little too young. But in a way, through my father, who kind of focused for quite a while collecting minimal and conceptual art and art proper, I was exposed to it very early on. It was basically part of our life. By the time I got 8, we started to kind of reintroduce ourselves to a small place in Italy where my grandfather is coming from, and we started to build a sculpture park soon after we came back. And there I got already kind of pretty first-hand involved in the selection and also in hosting the artists. So I got to know the art and I got to know the artists. But a little later, when they all had their career, while Julian was kind of more or less able, I think from the mid-70s on, you were able to witness really the kind of breakthrough and the dominance of conceptual art all over Europe, I would say.
Yeah, that's kind of true. I mean, my approach to art was a gradual one from when I was a teenage boy, because of lucky circumstances. You know, there was art, or people were talking about art, all kinds of art in my family. One of my grandfather was a painter. You know, these kind of things. And when I was actually already in the late 60s, I was really getting into it. I was really becoming interested. One big thing, of course, at that time, especially in Germany, was the presence of mainly US-American pop art. But I liked that. It was one of my first, big experiences. But at the same time, I was very much drawn to minimalism and slightly later to conceptualism. And then I went to study art history because people told me if you want to work with contemporary art, at least in Germany, it's better to have a diploma. And the best thing possibly is to study art history. So I did that always with the aim to become a curator of contemporary art in the public field. Not in the commercial field, but in the public field. And I think that there was two things that I learned from minimalism and that I learned from conceptual art. Because minimalism, as the name says, there's nothing much to see. But so you have to train your eyes and you have to train your brain to see the differences, to see the tiny differences and how these make interesting works of art. And of course, conceptualism gave me the lesson to always question myself, what is art? How does art function? So to ask these very fundamental questions and always doubting what you already have found out, and doubting it with the help of the next work of art. And I think these are two very basic lessons for the understanding of the art of the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century and even today that I learned from these both tendencies.
Yeah, I would agree to that. I would add maybe that with minimal art, what you also can take away and learn is the importance of the relationship of an object and its surrounding space, which is half of minimalism. Really. And to understand that, or to look at the work of Karl Andre, for example, and to see what is the difference of that kind of sculptural concept to all the concepts we had before him, and how, let's say, how do you say that, how solid it may be. It was so solid that it would take him basically without great variations through his career, his early concept of sculpture as place. So this relationship is very important and became very important for me, and I became kind of very aware of this relationship between an object and its surrounding space, and what that relationship can actually become the meaning of the work. When it comes to conceptual art, I would say, just to make it simple, what I early understood, maybe not as a child, but as a young man, is something that, for example, an idea can be beautiful, and that there is a beauty of an idea, and if you get that, and you understand it, and you think it through, you may come to a point where an idea is good enough, or is actually as satisfying as looking at a finished work of art. And this is what I took away from early on, from being exposed to artists who would write sentences on our walls. And of course I didn't understand it as a young boy, but I understand that, and this also ignited a certain interest in language and in the philosophy of language, which I think you need to know a bit about to understand conceptual art. And these would be my big takeaways from both movements.
Maybe I should mention another teacher, so to speak, mine, whose work relates to these two tendencies. Early on in one of my first jobs, and actually a job for a very long time, was to be a curator in those Kunstmuseen in the city of Krefeld. You might not know, it's close to Düsseldorf in the Rhineland. And there were three premises, three buildings. And two of them were villas designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe in 1927, 1930. And they were used as houses for changing exhibitions of contemporary art since the mid-50s, and the other one since the early 80s. And I was very lucky to work there for quite a while. They're small, there's no furniture in it anymore, but you have the Miesian space. And the Miesian space tells you about discipline, and it tells you very much about the relationship, how to place a work in relation to that space, which is not only an inside space because of the large windows, it's also always at the same time an outside space, so to speak, virtually. Working with artists there, with existing work, but also in many, many cases with work that was specially made for an exhibition there, was another big, big lesson in relationship, especially to minimalism, but not only, because Mies' architectural thought is about essentials. You might question that, and he was very unfamous actually in the 80s for that very reason in the beginning, in the full flow of postmodernism. But nevertheless, Mies is always also, like conceptual art, asking very basic questions about what is architecture, what is a good space, what is the right space for a human being, a free human being.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, my father and I were lucky, and we also had a similar important figure who was Konrad Fischer at the time, who kind of introduced my father to the, at the time, the most avant-garde tendencies in art. You have to also consider, and we may talk about it later in more detail, that the art world was a completely different art world than the one we live in now. It was just by far smaller, and it was possible that, let's say a worldwide scene of 1,000 people, and they would all know each other more or less, because there were just not so many people interested in it. There was at the beginning for sure no money in it, which was good, because that would basically mean that only the real interested people would stick with it. And we had the opportunity, my father was introduced by Konrad Fischer in the late 60s, and then he moved to Düsseldorf, and he always had an office in Düsseldorf, which meant that I would visit Düsseldorf quite frequently and saw a lot of shows at Konrad Fischer Gallery, which basically is the perfect school if you want to know a bit about minimal and conceptual art, because this one gallery really worked with almost every artist of significance in that field. And so that's my intuitive access to art started there, kind of without reflecting it much, without knowing it really, but just by going to the gallery or going to a museum, to Mönchengladbach and other places as a child, and being exposed to these people and talking to the artists and all that, and then somehow later on I studied art history and philosophy, and then I did the recap in an academic way, so to speak. So the entire theory and the entire that part of that kind of art I did in a way with a delay.
I think as you mentioned Konrad Fischer, and you mentioned the whole situation in Western Germany, in the Rhineland in particular, in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, we were very privileged to be part of that scene, to become part of that scene, because it was small, it was international by definition, and it was really up to date. I mean, the latest new exciting things that came over, for example, from America, but also from other places. I mean, Gilbert and George, two very strange people coming over from London and doing a strange kind of performance on a table in the Kunsthalle in Düsseldorf. And you must imagine, if you haven't been to that region, it's full of museums and Kunsthalles, not so much anymore with the important gallery scene. That was the thing of the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, and then of course something happened and everything moved to Berlin and other places. Okay, that's how it happens. But we were very privileged because we came, I think both of us, although with the delay, with our interest, we came at the right moment in the right place and could learn from that and could slowly get involved in it and work with it. So, well, good luck, it was.
But Julian, would you say from an art historical perspective that that's, it's a discussion you always had probably, is minimal art and conceptual art, are those maybe the last isms we can, the end of modernism, if you wish? What is it for you? I mean, it's.
I don't call myself an art historian. I studied art history, but I'm not an art historian. I'm something else. I don't know what I am. A curator and writer about contemporary art, but not necessarily an art historian. But at the same time, of course, I know a little bit of history, and I think you're right. For me, these are the last isms at the end of the 20th century that really set a new example, a new paradigm. And a different paradigm from lots of other things. We should possibly mention, at least in my case, also a third tendency of the time, which is normally called by its Italian name arte povera, the poor art, including personalities and works like those of Joseph Beuys, for example, which was, I must admit, it was a very important other influence. But I think they were more within the tradition somehow. They did some very important things, and also there was a connection sometimes with minimalism, for example, not in the actual shapes, but in the way an object sits in a space. I think you're right. Possibly these kind of, and you could say that both tendencies are reductionists. In a positive way, of course, you can blame them for that. A lot of conservative people did blame minimalism and conceptualism for their reductionism, to empty out everything, even more than constructivist period or whatever, and just leave out language, the word, and a simple box on the floor, to put it metaphorically. But I think this kind of radicalism was possibly the last ism that could stand up as a clear statement. And after that, of course, with the 80s, it became very clear that now the game is open for all, and all kind of mixtures. I remember I was quite shocked when younger artists, slightly younger artists, suddenly introduced completely alien elements into minimalistic objects. I remember one artist, you have never heard of him, it doesn't matter, but this was a good example. And he was studying, he was a German artist who went to the United States, but he didn't study or didn't work in New York nor in California. He was in Detroit. And suddenly in the early 70s, he came up with plexiglass objects, very minimalistic, like, I don't know, like John McCracken or something like that. But the color was a strange kind of fleshy pink. And at the bottom of this plastic object, there was a row of white bird's feathers attached to it. Come on, this is impossible, this is forbidden. Following the kind of ideological version of minimalism. But of course, it's just an image, you know. It's just an image that things started to broke up and every combination became possible, but no ism was there anymore.
Yeah, I agree. Historically, I would try to differentiate and say that minimalism or minimal art, first of all, was pretty much a purely American phenomenon to begin with. I mean, there were European followers and Europeans who started to work in that tradition, but it was a rather small group of American artists who came up with it. They all didn't mean to be identified as the minimal artist at all. I think Karl Andre, for example, would call himself a sculptor. And with Sol Lourdes it's more complicated. But it's just happened a little earlier. So you have minimal art, let's say the primary structure show at the Jewish Museum was 63. And it was, I think also you could tell a story about how art is bound to its time somehow, right? Because before that we had a huge success for abstract expressionism. So there was still, like, you had the idea of the lonely artist working as a genius, making his paintings, expressing himself. And that just wasn't quite credible anymore. And it wasn't believable anymore. So they came up and they went to the fabric, to the shop, and they had their works produced. And they took away the hand. They didn't like the hand anymore. They worked with existing objects like Dan Flavin with fluorescent tubes. And so they kind of made that clear that, you know, this is not, we don't believe in that anymore. We don't believe in the whole dogma that the artist has to express his inner self with you know, on his own in a great struggle. So there is this kind of time, and then you can see how exciting the 60s were, because already 5 years later, the conceptual artists did away with minimalism in a way. You know, they did away with the object altogether, and that's an interesting. And maybe the last time we can detect these kind of movements erasing each other, because they were just not, they lost credibility in the case of abstract expression.
And it was also a kind of battle. It was really a kind of very intense discussion.
I mean, with Greenberg and Michael Fried and all that.
For example, and of course also among artists, but in another way, of course, than with the critics. Well, but yes, maybe first minimalism and then conceptualism kind of closed off the development of the 20th century, and now we're in a transitional phase. We don't know where things will go. Everything is possible again. People can paint, they can express themselves, and all kinds of combinations are possible. Some are interesting, more interesting, some are less interesting, of course. But there is no guidelines anymore, and this is, of course, a completely new situation also for young artists to find their way through this jungle of possibilities, jungle of styles or approaches or whole concepts or paradigms of what can art be today. And so it's understandable that a lot of people feel lost. I mean, I feel lost very often myself, you know, although I have seen quite a bit in the last few decades. But okay, we shouldn't complain about the present because somehow things are going on. Whatever art in 10 years from now will be, I have no idea.
I have no idea either. But maybe that's a good thing also.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. You don't have to be a partisan of this and that anymore.
It's also a good thing that you can't believably pretend anymore that you know it all.
Exactly.
I think nobody can say I know it all, because it's so much to know that it's impossible to know. And you know, I don't know much about Chinese contemporary production, for example, because for some reason it never hit me. I think in India, for example, it's a very interesting people working from what I saw, but I don't have the time to really get into it, or somehow it's too far away from me. So, but there was a time, and the times were really different, because then you could know it all, I think.
At that time you could know it all. You have to be on the mailing list of, let's say, 10 international galleries, and be well informed. And slowly you meet those, a fraction at least of those 1,000 people all over the world who were interested in that kind of art. And you read a few magazine articles. There were just also another 5, 6, 7, 8 worldwide art magazines that mattered. You knew the major critics, and it was easy to meet the artists. I mean, with Konrad Fischer, famous Konrad Fischer, such a figure really, although he never said much about art anyway. He always kept silent. He preferred to play cards and things like that. But he was an artist himself before he became a gallery owner, and that's also very
pop artist.
A pop artist, a German pop artist. But that's very telling also with his attitude and his good eye, as we used to say. With people with exhibitions like him, sometimes there were like 5 people for the opening. There was the gallery owner, his wife, the artist, his partner, and maybe 1 collector from Belgium.
And you.
Sometimes me. Well, I mean, but nevertheless, he stuck to those artists, and even if they didn't sell for many years, he stuck with them, and that was the very small scene, which nevertheless mattered a lot, and you felt to be part of it, and it's like, okay, we're tiny. It's a niche. It's a tiny little niche. It doesn't matter socially in a society at large, or not even in the cultural field.
No,
but we are important.
I mentioned that because we were also supposed to talk about collecting a little
Yes,
bit.
that's why I mentioned the Belgian Collector.
And so we can maybe talk a bit about how different it must have been to create a collection then, and how different this is now. Because I can just say, from my father's point of view, it was fairly simple to build at least the foundation of his collection. So basically he had Konrad Fischer. Konrad Fischer gave him the advice to maybe expand his vision a little bit and go to Antwerp to a gallery which was called White Space Gallery. And from there he got the advice that there's an interesting dealer in Cologne who was Rolf Ricke. So let's say there were 8 galleries, and he was kind of, once in a while he would visit them, and eventually he would buy something. And that program was so concise that it was, you know, for some reason it happened without much planning, that he built up the foundation for a very concise collection, because they were all dealing with arte povera, minimal art, and conceptual art. And then he had whatever, let's say 100 works, and he put them in the storage, and he forgot about it really for a long time, because he changed professions in a way and opened a publishing house. And then he dealt for more than 2 decades mainly with the early avant-garde, with Bauhaus photography and all kinds of other things, and published the first books about these things. And then he came back to it, and I'm just saying that because and that was in the late 80s, and he realized, oh my God, I have a collection. And then he got this kind of frantic idea, but I want to have a complete collection, so I want to have all significant artists in there. And it became much more difficult to continue in the 90s to do it. Not only because things were already more expensive, which in some cases was certainly the case, but also because the scene was already so widespread that it was harder to find the things.
Also, I think one aspect is very important for those artists, those collectors who started in the period of your father in the 70s, let's say. What they got was nearly always first-hand information. They traveled to this gallery, to that gallery, and they saw the work analog, not digital. They saw it right there in space. They saw the artist in many cases, and they met them immediately and started to talk about it, or about something else, which also teaches you about what the work is all about. You don't have to talk about art with artists. That's, I think, you can do this sometimes, sometimes not. And you possibly sometimes learn much more by talking about completely different things. And nevertheless, it gives you context for what you see in front of you. So this was this kind of analog, face-to-face relationship with the works you finally, as a collector, acquired. And this has changed, for example, very much so today. A lot of people buy images, images of works.
But even for you, and that's even, maybe we should talk about that difference, because you collected for institutions, but also, you know, let's say in the 80s. How did you do that? I mean, how was it? Was it always related to what you were showing, or did you have a preconceived concept of?
No, not a preconceived concept. But I think when you're working for a public institution and you're collecting, acquiring for a public institution, there's always something in the past. There's always some kind of foundation. Possibly it's a foundation that you think you can kind of continue in a free way, of course, because new things are always unforeseeable. Or you can say, well, this is a certain tradition, but there is no way to go on in that direction. I have to make a cut and start with something else. So I think this is very important when you work for the public, because institutions have a long history, and there should be some kind of continuation. Otherwise, every 5 years, a new museum director, completely new direction, it can end up in a big mess. At the same time, of course, you're right. In Krefeld, for example, in the 80s, we had a very close relationship between exhibiting and acquiring works. So actually, at one point in the late 90s, I made a list and I calculated, and I realized more than 60% of the works that we acquired for the collection have been shown before in exhibition in one of the houses, which means that we had a lot of time to look at them, to consider them. And sometimes they were not even bought during the exhibition or at the end of it, but 2 years later, because they were still in the storage of the gallery, which is quite unusual with interesting works. So we had to come back to them again and again and again to finally make up our minds and say, now I'm very really sure. Of course, sometimes the crate opens for the exhibition and you say, oh wow, and I must have it, and you reserve it immediately, although you have no money. That's the other thing. So I think, and that was still in the 80s, a period when, let's say, a young artist who comes from the art school is in the second half of 20s, let's say, and you could watch him or her develop easily for like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and then maybe you make up your mind, I think now the person is ripe, so to speak, for a solo show, for a small solo show, and you do it, and you can wait another few years before you first say, no, I think the work is so really developed and good, I want to have it in the collection because now it fits.
And this is probably impossible. No?
This is absolutely, it became impossible already in the 90s, in the late 90s. I mean, the museum didn't have that much money. We found new funding for it sometime, but the public funds were rather slow, and sometimes it was zero. But nevertheless, it was very difficult because the works were not available anymore. I mean, I was mentioning briefly the Belgian Collector, because where we were, it was one big art area, so to speak, Holland, Belgium, and partly France and West Germany, and they invaded our opening sometimes, because there's a long, long tradition of art collecting in the bourgeoisie of Flanders, and very, very important collectors. And they came, and of course they had their money ready in their pocket, so they could make up their mind immediately, and the museum was already by definition too late. But of course, if you really wanted it, you had first choice.
Yeah, I know about the Belgians too. I know some of them. I can tell a funny story if you want.
Yeah, please.
I mean, my father had, through the years, I don't know, for some reason with Konrad, the privilege sometimes to see a show before its opening, and then also to make a reservation, or just to say, this, I want this. And there was a show with Bruce Nauman, I think it was in '88, and I did that, and my father came a few days earlier and picked 2 sculptures, and then he went to Italy, or we went to Italy basically to spend holidays in Italy. And then Konrad called at the day of the opening and said, Egidio, you wouldn't believe what's going on here. All the Belgians are here. And there's 2 Belgian really important collectors. They really want your works, and can we do something? Oh. And then my father said, of course, just, you have them there free again. And 2 years later, Konrad came to Italy and basically said, okay, thanks for doing that. Here's a proposal for a sculpture, for your sculpture garden. And it was at that time the biggest and I think most important architectural work of Bruce Nauman at the time. So there was these kind of, the Belgians were very important always for the Rhineland. I think they kept the Rhineland afloat also. But they were also very particular collectors, very, very much characters, and they had time also. They had time, they were following, they had time also in their decision making, and they had the money, so it was an ideal situation. Yeah, we are losing these kind of characters, I would say.
I think we're losing these characters, and collectors don't have the time really anymore. I have another Belgian collector in mind, another very short story, around 1990 it was already, and he was already interested, he already had some work by Thomas Schütte, and I was showing in a group show a new work, a kind of new type of work, and of course he came and he said, oh well, I'm really interested, and he made a kind of reservation, but he didn't decide it immediately and said, okay, keep it open. Then like 3 months later, this piece traveled to a gallery in France. And again, the same collector went to this gallery in Burgundy, in France, to check it there.
Have a second look.
Have a second look. And then the piece traveled on, I forgot where, but let's say somewhere in Europe. And he traveled there again. Maybe it was in Italy, I don't remember. And he had a third look. And that was like 9 months later, he said, okay, now I'll buy it. And this is luxury.
Yeah.
This is luxury, but at the same time, it's hard work. I mean, you have to travel a lot, and you have to keep things open in your negotiations with the galleries, of course, because they want to sell safely as soon as possible into the right collections, of course. So it's a great luxury. It was a great luxury. At the same time, it was a hard job. It was serious professional collecting.
And again, now is that how can that be done in these days? Is it possible for anybody to take that time to focus, to be not influenced by all the news that surrounds us every day, and new talent here, new talent there, greatest artist ever appeared in New York, fantastic paintings in Belgium, what have you. I mean, this is how it works now, right?
Yeah.
And then 5 years later, you don't even hear anything about these artists anymore. So it's kind of, I mean, sometimes, I mean, I'm doing it. I'm trying to sell art to people and to museums, but it's very, it's a complicated thing now. It's in my case very often based on very personal relationships, which works best for me. And I don't have so many collectors who think about art as an investment, because I don't make these promises also.
Well, I think it's hard to give any advice to somebody who wants to start to collect contemporary art seriously nowadays. You could say, don't read any art magazines, don't read any Instagram messages about what's going on in the art world, don't do all that. Be a person of the future without social media, etc., etc., etc. It would be a funny advice, but then what to do? How to become knowledgeable within what's possible in contemporary art. What is it? You can't see the scene because the scene is global, and global by definition means it's too much for everyone involved. Even if you have an interest in Chinese art, you go there 3, 4, 5 times and like this, It's like the girl at the beach with a spoon taking a bit of water and putting it in a bucket. What are you doing there? Oh, I'm emptying the ocean. That's how, personally, most of us what they do when they go to China and learn a little bit about Chinese art, just as an example. The other thing is you could say, okay, only go to degree shows in important art schools. But that means that you already have developed a certain sensibility to see in the work of a 26-year-old something that is promising. How do you get that knowledge? How do you get that sensibility? I have no simple advice how to start. And the thing, from your point of view as a gallery, to say there must be some kind of personal relationship between the person who, in that case, sells the work, who promotes it, who explains it, and the person who buys it. It must be something among friends in a way, which is a very personal base. Of course, it includes the idea of speculation. And that's the difficult thing. I think a private collector, compared to a public collector, can never clearly separate the artistic value of a piece and the commercial value of the piece. It's nearly impossible, even for those who are fully into art and not into investment or speculation, because it's the money they earn themselves. Contrary to what I do as a museum director, it's not my money. Oh, it's a little bit of my money because I pay the same taxes in the same state, but basically I can really separate between the two, as long as I can pay the price. But I think a private collector always has this possibly conflict.
I mean, for example, in the case of my father, I learned from my father early on that the prices for art are pure fiction, fantasy, and the price of the work is what I'm willing to pay for. And that was his point of view, and he still believes that for some reason.
But your father is an exception, especially nowadays. As you can see,
sure.
The archive went as a donation to the museum in Dresden, and there's work also donated to the museum in Berlin. So that's an attitude which is 1% of the collectors?
There are more. I would say there are more.
3?
I hope 10.
Okay, then this 10% is all for you.
They are all mine.
Yeah.
No, but it's just because we were supposed to talk about collecting, and hopefully there are not many people expecting any serious advice, because I also wouldn't really be able to give too much good advice, except of buying only the things you like.
Buying only things you really personally like.
You have a relationship to, or you can develop a long-term appreciation eventually. And even then you might change, and in 10 years from now you find half of the things you bought not so interesting anymore. That happened to me, for example, in my small collecting activities.
And don't listen, but look.
Yeah.
And today there's so many voices telling you what is important in art every week or every season, let's say. And of course you have to let those information somehow into yourself or out again. And don't follow those voices. But look, if you really truly find the relationship between yourself and the work in question that you chance upon possibly, that nobody told you to look at, but you turn around the corner and you see something, you say, wow, that has something to do with me personally. Can I afford it? Then I buy it. If I can't afford it, I just love it.
Should we open it up to the audience maybe? Are there any questions you may have? Not so many.
Not yet, not yet.
One question.
Yeah.
Okay, one question. Is it better to buy pieces of living artists or already by dead artists?
It's only important to buy pieces by good artists. There's so many bad dead artists. I tell you. I've been to the graveyards. No, I think it's another market. I mean, if we're talking about the interesting, important work, it's another market.
Well, it is another market in a way. I opened my gallery with the dead, then even dead artists. But I think that doesn't make a difference. As long as you like it, go for it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
From the perspective of artists, I have you've told very nice stories about Belgian collectors. I have some experience with also very charismatic Belgian collectors back at the beginning of the 2000s. I was working at that time with Jan Mott gallery. He is still very dedicated to the conceptual art, and he organized my show and also screening at the cinema, and he invited some collectors, local collectors, and then we had dinner, and of course he's as a gallerist he wants that they buy something, and then they ask the price, and they say like, well, I like this really piece, and it's really affordable. It's not a problem for me. But you are coming from Vilnius, and I really would like to know what is the price of your work there, and how many people already have bought your work there, and how many institutions have it in a collection. And they said, the museum is not buying contemporary art by the kind of decision of the director at that time. We don't have collectors, and we have one commercial gallery. At that time, it was mostly focusing about painting and so on. So, well, it's really great work, and I appreciate it a lot, but I will not buy. And I think it's really significant. In a way, I'm opening discussion from other perspective, that the places have to have the infrastructure with the collectors, with the public kind of sort of attention, in a way to support local artists. Without the private initiatives also collecting and buying international and local artists, it's not possible. And I think this kind of turn of 2000s, what you say, it's not anymore 1,000 people which know each other. The rules of collecting have changed because of opening, let's say, new territories. So maybe you could reflect on this sort of situation of post-2000.
I mean, the story you told us sounds quite familiar to me. I remember let's say, an artist, a Polish artist, who became successful quite early on after 1990 internationally. And I remember discussions with colleagues and collectors and people like that, and said, yeah, but he doesn't live in Warsaw anymore, he's in New York now. Exactly for that context, because then there are a lot of collectors, there are a lot of galleries, there are a lot of museums that possibly have collected or have acquired or are dealing with this artist, and this seems to be a kind of confirmation for the possible buyer that this is something which has a value. Particularly, of course, if you come from a smaller country or country with a less developed situation concerning contemporary art, mainly, as you rightly say, a public institution that deal with it in a serious and continuous way, your reputation on the, let's say, the market is by definition already lower, as this Belgian collector told you, bluntly to your face, so to speak. That's true. So why don't you move to New York? This would be the cynical advice. Of course, you're right not to do that, because you come from a place, and if you're a serious person, you relate to the place one or the other way inside your art. Very much, in your case, I think, quite a lot. And so you can only try to fight for a good public museum in your context. Of course, you can't do it as an individual. We've just seen the new museum opened here a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical if this can develop into the kind of context building institution that you have in mind, and which would be desirable for such a place like Vilnius, like Lithuania, or the Baltic in general, because it comes out of the sudden, out of the blue, of somebody's mind, and you ask yourself why. And so I'm looking
also,
forward.
it is the opposite of any international space.
Yeah.
It's basically a museum which is full of Lithuanian painting, which is fine, and there's nothing to say against it, but I think this approach won't really bring the art world in Lithuania any further. Because it would be much more intelligent to show what you artists here do, but in a context that is international. Because then you can compare, and then you can find, maybe the right place for where you are. And this museum doesn't allow that at all, the way I saw it today. It's basically a massive collection of Lithuanian painting.
It's an archive more than an active museum, I think.
Like that. And I hope they will somehow find a way to allow for an encounter of what is happening here in Lithuania with what is happening elsewhere in the world, which is actually what the Galleria Vartai does, and hopefully other places. We just visited a very small but very nice off space here in Vilnius, and they do exactly that. They had a video by Rodney Graham, and that was shown together with 2 videos by a Lithuanian artist who was working already in the 70s. And we appreciated that very much. So I hope you will have more initiatives like that here, because this will bring the whole scene much quicker, much further. I think this is the way to go.
And the information,
to learn.
Funny enough, the information travels very fast. The information about the new museum here hasn't traveled to me before I arrived here on Saturday. But the information about that tiny space, which is from a living room in an apartment where still a number of people are living, traveled through one of your collectors to you on Friday, I think, last. Because it is something special, it is something interesting, it is something to the point. And those information travel around to the right people. Whereas something possibly even massive, the information doesn't travel, it stays within its own context, in your old beloved soup, so to speak. And that's a problem.
So what is the secret place? It's really intriguing now to hear.
It's really an apartment with a couple of young people, curators, and decided to open one room and organize.
It's on the Solo Street or not?
It's called, what is it called? Tattoo, Montos Tattoo, which is a nice name, I find too.
I don't know what that means, Montos Tattoo.
Nothing.
Nothing is in the backyard, you know,
Dada.
classical off space in the backyard, tiny, you have to make an appointment, of course, after the opening. And maybe there's one visitor a week or a month, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. And they even refrained from using the social media to advertise it because they think the social media is over already. They do it by word of mouth.
I was
Before
impressed.
people-
I mean, I really liked it. It was a very
And-
simple, small thing. It's
There was a
like
feeling, you know, there was a feeling that this is something where it happens. It's nothing big yet, of course, but it's the right attitude to create a context that matters, a context that sorry, I forgot the mic, context that has an outlook and is not looking backwards like in other institutions.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it was more interesting to go there than to the museum in a way. I don't want to, you know, it's not that it's all bad painting that you see there, but it's just a lot, and it seems to be a little mindless or carelessly organized, and it doesn't have any context. And I know a similar place.
It has
in
too much context.
Yeah, but no international context.
Yeah.
I know a museum in Austria where you have the same problem. There's a collector who built his private museum, only Austrian art. It's the same disaster. Although Austria is a little bigger, but without a context, it doesn't make. You don't have. You should be able to compare and to widen your horizon.
Yeah, and to be critical to what you are used to. Because we always love what we are doing somehow, of course. We need that as human beings. But at the same time, when it comes to art and when it comes to the fucking business of making a distinction between one and the other, you have to be open to criticize yourself, your own approaches, and even your own base if you feel the need to do that. And for example, this museum seems to be lacking of criticism completely. The whole institution, the whole concept of what is criticism, I mean, not what people write in the paper, but as a state of mind, was lacking for me from that museum. And I think this is fairly important, especially for a public, or in that case, let's call it semi-public museum, because the money comes from a private source.
Are there any other questions, or maybe we call it?
Sorry for being so critical about the institution. Okay.
What's your opinion of Broad Museum in LA, for instance?
The Broad Museum, have you seen it yet?
I haven't been there.
Me neither.
I would say I would be, to begin with, critical if a collector has such an influence on an institution, which is not really a private museum, right? There is public money involved, and it seems to be that he really kind of controls what's going on, and that's a bit of a problem. I have a problem to begin with, without even having seen the museum.
But of course we have to put it into the context of what is a museum in the United States. It's so much different from the European tradition, where a museum is basically by definition still a public institution. More so in one country than in another country, whereas in the United States is always a kind of a mix or between a lot of private money and influence, and something which you might call a public institution. But of course there are examples that work very well, where the output is fairly balanced, where there is a kind of critical control of what private money does. And there are other institutions, I think, given also the history of Eli Broad, this is a politician, and he wants to kind of dominate, and he's influencing a whole area, a whole region, and an important one, with all his activities, and that museum now as the crown of his kind of career.
I mean, we all know that it's different in America, but I worked at PS1 and we had a board, and the board is important. You would have to pamper the board members, of course, but they didn't have any influence in what we were shown. And this is not the case in LA. There's nothing on view that has not been at least checked. And you can, I mean, we have the problem with our old idea of a fully public funded museum is dead in Germany, so it doesn't work anymore. There's not enough public funding for that. So all the German museums trying to find ways and trying to be creative and doing public-private partnerships, all kinds of models. So we are just right now reinventing the funding structure of main European museums.
Yeah. Yeah, also the whole frame of mind has shifted in the last 30 years, of course, very much. Let's say, to put it in a very simple political way, after more than 30 years of neoliberalism, it has also affected the museum world very much. Nowadays, a museum director of something slightly bigger museum, you have to be a manager first of all. You have to know how to sell your product. And there was a time when even museum people talk like this, you know, selling their product, which is the museum, which is exhibitions, which are collections. So it is not only that because of the economic waves, suddenly there's less money than before, it's also the frame of mind has changed. And that's how it is. I mean, we can't just voluntarily change that, so we have to adapt to it in an intelligent way without losing basic concepts of what a public institution, an institution for civil society is. And I think actually the museums are not at the forefront maybe, but they are important factors in political life to fight for the continuation of a civil society, as we possibly had it more so in, let's say, the 60s or 70s in our country where we come from.
Okay, should we end it here, or are there any other questions? Then we would say thank you very much. I would say at least.
We all stand up and then we can converse freely. Thank you.